All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Nina Collins, and I'm super pleased today to be here with Ellen Friedrichs, a health and sex educator from Brooklyn. I know Ellen from our community in Brooklyn. She's actually taught a couple of my kids. Um, and actually, this morning I posted that you were going to be on, Ellen, and Jennifer Wilkin, who's a wolfer in our community,
Oh,
she wrote and said, "Oh, we love Ellen." So Jennifer's the
oh,
educator.
I
Apparently,
just, that's so nice. I just taught some of her fifth graders virtually on Zoom. How nice is that?
she's really great. I actually met her in
Yeah,
real life right before this all happened.
wonderful.
So I'm really glad to talk to you. I actually, I've known Ellen loosely for a long time, and one of my kids really worshipped her at a
Oh,
critical point in seventh grade. But we're not personal friends, and we don't really know each other. And I saw on Instagram that you posted something about Sex Ed Awareness Month, I think it's called. And then I did a little, internet
yeah.
discovery expedition on you and found out that you've written a book. And in the Wolfer community, which is a community for women over 40, we talk a lot about sex. It's a lot about health, sex, relationships, and we're really very candid and really believe in a lot of the things I think I'm sure you believe in about around shame and around vulnerability and around communication and being open. So I thought it would just be fun to have you on. So thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. That's great. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and Ellen's book, everyone, is called Good Sexual Citizenship: How to Create a Sexually Safer World, from Cleese Press. I think that's how you pronounce it, Cleese, right?
Yeah,
Which is
Cleus, exactly.
Simon and Schuster. And I've been reading the book all this week, and it's great. And it's actually it's a book about sexual education. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit here about
Sure.
the importance of sexual education, and I'm curious how you got into it. But also, I really read your book really as a feminist manifesto. I mean, it's really a
Yeah,
book
yeah.
about feminism. So I guess one of my first questions is, at one point in the book, you sort of joke, you say that you've been accused of being a humorless feminist since you were 16.
Yes.
Totally struck a chord with me. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what you meant by that and maybe segue into kind of how you got into this whole world.
I mean, that is kind of the rallying cry. I feel like I have battled my entire life and professional life now. But for me, I guess I just feel like I think I'm funny. I think I have a good sense of humor, but I don't think everything is funny. And I think that that is something, when I was a teenager and kind of learning about issues that I cared about and social justice, I probably had a lower tolerance than the rest of my peers for various antics. But now, as an adult and as somebody who really cares about this work, I really have explored the role of dismissing things as just a joke, as a
Mhm.
way to create conditions for sexual hostility.
Mhm.
And I think so often what happens is that, as anybody who cares about social justice, as anybody who identifies as a feminist, you get so easily dismissed when you are taking something seriously that other
Right.
people want to write off. And there's this whole idea that when we tolerate sexist, homophobic, racist jokes or comments,
Mhm.
that really kind of paves the way for increasing levels of hostility. And
Yeah.
so when we point that out, we take out a lot of
Get
the,
labeled. Right.
yeah, the validation for, oh, can't you take a joke? Why are you being so uptight? That just opens the door for harassment and then ultimately violence, right? Because
Mhm.
people who harass or perpetrate violence don't often call themselves sexual harassers, or in the case of sexual violence, rapists. They say, oh, I was just flirting, or it just got a little out of hand, or that wasn't really rape, right? But it is this kind of ladder, if you
Yeah.
think about it, where we kind of escalate.
So being a humorless feminist, which does sound like a funny thing, but there's a lot that's real about that, right? It's the idea of I'm not taking shit past a certain like I have a line.
Sure, right. And for me, rape jokes aren't funny. I just don't find that stuff funny. I point out a lot of sexist comments that my students make that and at this point in my life, if I'm saying to a 14-year-old, hey, that's not funny, I don't care if they think that I'm being boring and uptight. That's my role in a lot of ways, to be that
Right.
voice. There are definitely other points in my life where that role was a little less comfortable, where I
I
didn't
think
always want to be that voice.
Right. I think it was in your book. I'm pretty sure. I've been reading a lot in the last few days where you talked about an experience you had listening to song lyrics and
Yeah,
recognizing where they're feminist and where they're racist or sexist or
yeah.
and that was a good it's a good teaching moment, certainly, right? But it's also important for us to think about that all the time, like how much things are seeping in.
And for me, I really never want to police what people are watching, particularly my teenage students, right? This is not for me to say, you can't watch that show, you can't like that artist. This is, that's not my job. But I do see it as my job to make them aware of what they're consuming so that they can be critical consumers of the media and the music and the popular culture that they are absorbing. So we do in seventh grade, you mentioned, but I'm sure we did something similar when your kids were my students. But in seventh grade, I'll show a lot of music videos, and I love music videos. I love pop music. As a kid, I loved metal, and I've loved rap, and I've loved indie music. But I continue
Rap is
to
hard.
be, yeah. I mean,
There's
there's a whole
Yeah, there's
range.
some music my kids listen to where I say, I just can't listen to this. You have to turn it off. And I love,
And I
I
think
love that.
that's
Yeah,
no, and I
but
think
some of
that's,
them.
totally as a parent, that's something that is also an important thing to do. I do that with my own kids, not so much about music, but actually with my littlest, who's only 4, my kids are 4, 11, and 13. I hate the TV shows she watches because
Mm,
so many of the cartoons are actually just reinforcing such awful messages and particularly gendered messages. But with my
like what?
students,
Can you
oh,
think of
she
examples?
watches some show called Winx that just talks. I mean, it's just a lot of um, girls can't do this, boys don't
Mm,
like that. Competition among girls is just expected. It's normal to be mean to people. So those kind of messages
yeah,
that seem
yeah.
really gendered, and I have to admit, I cannot sit through an entire episode of a lot of these
But
shows.
I mean, that's so great. I mean, as an educator and as a parent, I think making your opinion known about those things is hugely valuable. I mean, obviously it can be annoying to the kids, but it's who you are, it's who your values, what your values are. So tell
And
me,
again, I don't want to put, I don't want to make things off limits for other people's kids, and I'm pretty lax with my own, but I definitely am that parent who points things out.
yeah, and I mean, I'm hugely tolerant. I think of what other people want to do with their kids and in their lives, but you also want to have your own lines and understand what you think is okay and what's not okay. How did you get into this work? I know you're Canadian. How old are you? Can
Yeah.
I ask?
I'm 44.
Okay,
So I'm in your community demographic.
definitely.
So yeah, I grew up in Vancouver, and I had done my undergrad degree in Vancouver in women's studies, which I think most programs, including the one I did, are now called gender and sexuality studies. There still is a women's studies discipline, but it's kind of evolved in a lot of places. So I did a degree in women's studies, and then I did grad school in New York in health education at NYU, and I focused on human sexuality education, sex
Wow,
ed.
so you always knew this is what you wanted to do. You had a
I mean, it's
strong.
funny looking back, I was in my early 20s, so it feels like that. At the time, I didn't feel like I knew exactly where I wanted to go with this, if I wanted to be in education or not. I had taken a few years off between undergrad and grad school and actually worked with teenagers and nonprofits. Um, but my original trajectory was that after I finished grad school, I had worked actually during grad school at the newly opening Museum of Sex in Manhattan,
Yeah,
and they were
been there.
having. So I worked on their inaugural exhibit, which was sexual subcultures in New York in the 1800s, and it felt very academic. And then I worked for many years at a community program in the Bronx, working with kids around HIV. I worked with Planned Parenthood on their teen website. I went to India for half a year and did sex education training with social workers. And then I came back and got more into teaching. So I really started kind of focusing on teaching kids and also college. So I've taught college students pretty much, gosh, 15 years or so. I've adjuncted as
Uh,
well.
That's great at Brooklyn College or something.
Yeah, yeah. I had started out, I had done that at Rutgers for a long time. And then I've been at Brooklyn College
It's
for years.
incredibly valuable. So how do you, I guess I'm curious about like how sex education has changed. Like I'm 50, so I'm a little older than you. My memories of sex education were pretty basic, the condom and the banana, but it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
when I was a kid or in middle school, it was like a few classes during the year. Right now, at least I think where you teach, there's an ongoing curriculum, and a lot of places there are. So I'm curious how it's changed a little. And also, I don't remember getting any sex education in college. I went to Barnard. So what's the difference when you're teaching high school students and college students? I mean, I'm sure in college now, with the culture of consent and Me Too, there's probably a lot around consent.
I mean, it really depends where you are, and the same could be said for sex ed. I am so lucky to teach in a school where we really believe in comprehensive health education. So health education isn't just sex ed, it's mental health, it's substance use, but we do a whole curriculum starting in 5th grade through 12th grade on sexuality and sex education as well. And I feel really fortunate because we can teach comprehensively, which means all those topics that you mentioned: consent, sexual pleasure, sexual development, gender identity, all of these. Social justice is a huge part of sex education when it's done well. But it is so varied. You know, New York State currently has a bill pending that would mandate comprehensive sex education in public schools. It's amazing. It's been sitting there for a year and it has not, moved past committee yet. Washington State in January just mandated comprehensive sex ed, but this is not the norm. Across the country, students are still getting what used to be called abstinence only until cross-gender marriage sex education, but has now been rebranded as sexual risk avoidance. It's the same thing. It's basically across the country, children in public and private schools are being taught this program, which is a really value-driven message that the only appropriate place to have sex is in a cross-gender marriage, often just with the purposes of procreation. It doesn't teach about sexual orientations beyond being hetero or to pose, any other sexual orientation or gender identity other than being cis hetero as a negative or a risk. In 7 states, 6 now, Arizona just repealed the law, but in 6 states, there are literally laws that ban teachers from the promotion of homosexuality. They've been nicknamed, I don't know if I love this, but this is what, the nickname is, no promo homo laws that are egregious. Arizona repealed their law last year. There's still 6 states. This is horrible homophobic, post-AIDS kind of early 90s laws that have been there ever since. So it really depends. And then you have some really amazing programs. You have in California and New Jersey where LGBT history is part of a required curriculum.
Really? New Jersey?
Yeah. I think Illinois has a pretty progressive queer history requirement. So there are some places, and it's just so piecemeal.
So we are, as we know, kind of living in a bubble in Brooklyn, and in this particular way where you teach, it's way on one end of the continuum, and it really varies all over the country.
It's such a range. But you asked, what has changed for me. So what's both the way I teach has really evolved, I think, and I hope for, in many positive ways. For younger children, I used to separate them by gender. I'm very happy that I don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I remember
that was, that's something that felt artificial at the time. And I started, I finished grad school in 2002. So I've been doing this in some form for close to 20 years. And so that I'm really happy that is just not been something that I have done for well over a decade. But I think back to those classes and they, were really different. And that was something that I only did for the younger grades. But can't imagine doing a class like that anymore.
Well, it makes sense also now. I mean, with the comfort of, the gender issues, I'd say one of the biggest things that's changed in my life, even my youngest child, Bruno, who you knew, is 19. And when my kids were in school, there wasn't all this, sorry, I'm really afraid I'm going to get the terminology wrong. And then my daughter Ruby.
Everybody is learning. This is
but there wasn't all this gender fluidity that there is even now. And Bruno's 19. And I'd say when he was in middle school, there were no kids who were playing with gender the way now it seems incredibly common for people to, at young ages, to be talking about.
Yeah, I think there really has been a shift. And I think this is really freeing and exciting. And, all these kids who had not felt that they could express themselves authentically, who now at much younger ages have a lot more space.
Yeah, but
That being
to that
said,
point, totally makes sense having both boys and girls in the same sex ed class. Why would you separate them?
I mean, I think about the kids, who the non-binary kids in particular, who really, even had we said, which I think we did, that any child who was trans could attend any class that felt comfortable for them. That label doesn't even apply to a lot of the children for whom those binary divisions just aren't accurate. And the
Mhm.
thing that I stress so much now, particularly in puberty education, is that what children go through when they start puberty and they experience puberty is so much more similar than different. I
Mhm.
think for so long as a sexuality educator, we stress the differences. This is what happens to a boy's body. This is what happens to a girl's body. And I completely have reversed course on that and really now highlight the similarities. And yeah, if you have certain body parts, you will have certain experiences. But let's talk about our commonalities. What's the most common experience that we go through? We are much more alike than different. So that's
That's
kind of
great.
how I've
That's very
evolved with
cool.
teaching. Yeah.
Super interesting. So then that makes me wonder about things like, because your book is so really fundamentally feminist in every way, I really admired it. How do you deal with teaching things like concepts around toxic masculinity? And when you're
Yeah.
dealing with boys and girls and you don't want to seem biased, right? And you're there for everyone. How do you handle that subject? And I'm also curious how you think about that subject in the larger world. Like, has it changed? Is it changing?
I think it's so amazing to teach students who are so aware of so many issues going on in the world. I constantly tell my students that, they are just leaps and bounds ahead of where anybody I knew as a teenager was in their just knowledge of the world and their concern about the world and their awareness of issues and their activist spirit. I mean, we have this amazing generation of young people who I think is really, hopefully, going to do better than my generation. And when it comes to teaching about these issues, I think for a lot of kids, hearing terms like toxic masculinity for a lot of young people, for a lot of men, that just turns them off, right? But what I try to do is unpack the issues um, rather than present
Label it.
a lesson on toxic masculinity,
Mhm.
on feminism. Let's explore these issues. I've been thinking about that so much recently with the new Title IX rules that Betsy DeVos just announced.
Mhm. Yep.
I think a week ago today, maybe, that, you know, these new rules, which basically have been analyzed and determined to offer increased protections for students accused of sexual assault. And a lot of sexual assault experts have come forward, and victim and survivor advocates, to say this is really going to prevent people from coming forward about being victims of assault. So, what do I think about that in terms of a relationship to, say, toxic masculinity and how we teach children, is that adding more rules is not the way we're solving this problem. What we need to do is talk more about sex ed earlier, and that sex ed that looks at everybody in the room, and this is what I try to do, say, I never want a single person in here to have to endure a sexual assault, and I never want someone to commit one. And let's figure out how we prevent both sides. Nobody here, I look at my classrooms and I think
Everyone's
nobody here wants to be on either side.
right.
Right? And how do we raise children and send them out in the world? And there was a study out of Columbia Mailman about a year or two ago that found that getting comprehensive sex ed in high school reduced the likelihood of being involved in a sexual assault at college.
Really?
So, oh yeah, I can send you the
Right.
link.
I mean,
So this is important stuff that we don't just want to tell girls, don't drink too much, have a buddy system, carry a rape bristle, learn self-defense. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I'm a fan of self-defense. I think there are a lot of important ways that we want to move in the world. But I think for too long, we have forgotten the other piece, right? What does consent really look like? It's not just this getting a verb loud yes. What are 1,000 ways that someone can say no?
Mhm.
How drunk is too drunk? I mean, if you just say you can never have sex with somebody after having a beer, you're going to just have people tune out, right? Like that's not their lived experience. So how do we create safer situations when we're talking about substances and mixing sexuality? I mean, I have my opinions about that. I think young people who are new to sex and new to alcohol should not mix the two together.
Right.
That's my opinion. But then you have a kid at a party who's new to drinking and new to sex. They're not thinking Ellen said, never ever do this, right? So how do
Right.
we give them tools
And of
to
course, like everyone, it seems like a lot of it comes down to communication, right? You're teaching kids how to
really?
communicate about all this stuff. We have a question from someone in the someone listening. With everyone in lockdown and adults and kids of all ages in close proximity, parents seem inhibited about taking time for sex. What are your tips for those who are finding it hard to make private time for themselves?
For parents, I mean, I think
Or for
there's
kids?
a or for kids, right? I mean, this is, less my area, but I guess I would just suggest, first of all, to give yourself a break. If you don't feel like having sex right now, I think that's okay, right? A lot of people are not feeling
I'm not
quarantine
particularly
sexy.
feeling very
It's
sexy.
not for a lot of people. And I think there's kind of this idea or this pressure that if you want to have a healthy relationship, you need to have a regular sex life. You know what? Everything is wild right now.
Yeah.
And if you're just not feeling it, if your kids are all over the place, this isn't going to be forever. I would say don't beat yourself up. But if
Yeah.
you are that person who always had sex at night and now you're exhausted, screens can do wonders. Put kids
Right. And
on
I
the
would
screen.
say if you are feeling, because I'm in a house with a lot of people,
Yeah.
and the thing I keep saying over and over and over and over again throughout this pandemic is boundaries. So if you
Mhm.
are Robin, who asked the question, if you are wanting to have sex and feel like you don't have the privacy, make the privacy. Say you're going to your room for, early at 8 o'clock at night and you don't want to be disturbed. I think
Or at
that's
11 in the morning when everybody's on Zoom TV or screens or
your
whatever.
room and close the door. I feel like I have so many things. I'm kind of interested more in talking about this idea of toxic masculinity for a second,
Mhm.
because it just interests me. It is such a label and it's a stupid label and it's a word I would never say to my son, for example. But I think as a feminist, I am interested in, and you have a son, right? You have two sons?
Yeah, I have one. I have two girls and a boy. Or
Thinking
thus
about how,
far, this is how they appear to identify.
yeah, okay. Thinking about how we raise men or people who identify as men,
Yeah.
um, is challenging, and I just wonder what it's like, because you're not separating out the girls from the boys. I wonder if there are particular challenges in that way with teenage boys. I'm just kind of
Oh,
curious
I
about it.
think completely. I mean, I think, nobody wants to feel accused,
Yeah,
right? It's the same thing as like, no white person wants to acknowledge their racism. It's
right,
people feel super defensive. They feel under attack. Me personally, why are you saying that I am doing this thing?
right.
And as soon as you get someone in a defensive position, it does become harder to have productive
Yeah, and of
conversation.
course, so much of what they're learning, what we're all learning, is just seeping in from the culture. It's not like it's not their fault, but it is the reality of
Sure.
the way we live, right?
And I think that, you know, this it's not just this is the thing that I think is so tricky. It's not just it can't come from any one place. It can't come from a once a week middle school health class where we look at gender stereotypes, right? This is part of the culture. So I try both at home and professionally to challenge a lot of the prevailing ideas about boys. I
Mhm.
try to do this in my own home as well. And actually with my son who is 11, my littlest who's 4 is super gendered. She is very binary, if you will, in her thinking about what girls can do and what boys can do.
Hmm.
And my 11-year-old is the one who's constantly challenging her. Boys can wear pink, boys can like princesses,
Nice.
boys can wear nail polish. So he has, through whatever personality or living with me for this long, become that mouthpiece. And that is so much more effective than hearing it from me. I
Yeah,
find that in classes too, that
that's a good
having
point.
other students
Yeah,
weigh in
yeah.
when there's kind of a pushback is just so much better.
Which is, of course, another really basic, clear argument for better and more, sex ed, because you get it coming from the kids. You get the kind of the conversation going and different views, and through that conversation, you can teach people.
But I think also to other things, empathy. We do a lot in middle school about empathy, right? We want to humanize people. We want to humanize boys. We want to humanize girls. We want to humanize people of all gender identities. But I think one of the issues is one of my problems with jokes at another person's expense about their identity is that you're dehumanizing someone. And when you dehumanize someone, it makes it so much easier to treat them poorly,
Yeah,
right? If
yes.
you refer to women in a disparaging way, then it doesn't matter what you do to them because they don't have the same humanity as yours. So in middle school, we start doing exercises on empathy and how do you think somebody else would feel if they experienced this? Even if it's not the same way you feel, how do you imagine they would feel? And I think it's just so multi-pronged that I also want to look at boys who act out in ways that are really upsetting to me personally as a feminist, as a person, as a teacher, and also look at them with empathy. Why did you post that? Why did you say that? Why did you
Right.
pressure that person? What messages about being a boy have forced you to think that the only way you can prove your heterosexual masculinity is by pursuing this girl in a way that's really creepy,
Right.
right?
It speaks a little bit to, and you of course reference Brene Brown at times in your book, and we all love her. But her idea about vulnerability, I mean,
Mhm.
I always think that that's so completely linked to empathy. I used to run an empathy curriculum for medical residents at
Oh,
maternity in
amazing.
Brooklyn, and that idea of if you can get people to talk about what's underneath, then you see each other's humanity, right? So
Yeah.
if you're able to be vulnerable, it really changes the game completely. So if you're getting a kid who's being aggressively whatever toxically male, and you can get him to kind of understand why he's doing that, you can maybe break it open a little.
And I think that, so much of what I do as an educator, I am not somebody, I'm not trying to ferret out that real, I would say, sociopath who wants to sexually assault somebody for the pure pleasure of hurting another person, right? Like that is a subset of people who cause sexual harm out there. I think a lot of what we're seeing intra-community wise and on college campuses, for example, are people who don't understand consent,
Right.
who and when I say that, that really can sometimes get people's hackles up because consent is obvious. Either somebody enthusiastically confirms that they want to do something or they don't. But I think in reality, for two people in certain situations where they have learned these gendered scripts, always
Mhm.
have to keep going until they, and I'm talking about cross gender experiences mainly, of course, people of any gender can be assaulted or commit assaults. But I think there's so many gendered scripts that are playing in people's heads. You throw alcohol into the mix, and I don't believe that there is a gray area, but I think a lot of people think there is. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what I want to unpack. I think there's that. I think the empathy piece, right, where we have to humanize others. I think that we really need to just undermine a lot of the gendered assumptions that push people into really unpleasant experiences. So I
Yeah.
think that more than, looking at everybody who commits an assault as a fully horrible person,
Right. I
uh,
completely agree.
is going to be much more effective. And I think I was mentioning about the new kind of education rules, right? These rules, these Title IX rules that were just introduced last week for college campuses, and I think also actually high schools too, which offer different and additional protections for students accused of assault. Problem is, making more laws and rules generally doesn't make people safer, right?
Right.
And so this has been proven time and time again
Right.
that if you make a new rule, you have to enforce it. And who is going to have these rules enforced against them? Often the most marginalized people.
Mhm. Mhm.
And what is going to happen is that people aren't going to be safer on campuses. And it's just this very limited view of justice, right? So in
Right.
my opinion, what we need is better sex education.
Right. To start earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah.
challenge hostile cultures. Look at restorative justice programs. I think these ideas are actually going to change people's safety on college campuses more than just saying here are more rules and boys are getting accused and they didn't do anything. And we know that false accusations are just so uncommon
Yeah.
that they're
Yeah.
amplified in people's minds.
So the work is really improving health and sex education everywhere, starting at a younger age, all around the country, not having it be in conflict.
Just that. I mean, nothing. It's no big deal.
Super easy. All right, I have a couple more questions, even though, do you mind if we run a little bit over?
No,
Just
no, that's fine.
things. I loved in your chapter, Standing Up for Sex, you talk about a first paper you have students write, where you ask them to think about questions like, what is your earliest memory of sex? And, could you get questions answered about sex by people you trusted growing up? And I just really wanted to share that I loved all those questions. It was a long list of questions.
Yes.
It was something that adults should do too, that you should run. I mean, maybe you do already do this, run sexuality workshops for adults where they think about those issues, because we see in our community, um, we're hearing and talking about sexual problems from a different perspective, right? Obviously, we're not teenagers, we're women in our 40s, 50s, 60s. Um, but things like the orgasm gap, like the fact that women still
Sure.
don't have orgasm often. I mean, I do think one upside of getting older for women is that they generally are having better sex because we get more comfortable knowing what we want and how to ask for it and how to talk about it. But it's still a huge issue in the lives of women. So I was interested in your kind of sex questionnaire, and that you get people to do this. And I was wondering if you ever do it with adults.
So I don't normally. I'm open to that idea. The usual populations that I've worked with are college students and teenagers and middle schoolers. But I do, I really was speaking in that chapter to adults because I think so many of us just have a lifetime of shame and discomfort with sex, right? All the messages that we got growing up that we just assimilate into our own sex lives that mean that, right, the orgasm gap, which continues. That has just only recently, I think, been
Even
discussed
been
in.
identified. Well, tell us, in case our readers don't know, what is the orgasm gap?
So, if you have cross-gender partners, it is much more common for men to have orgasms than women. And in some situations, in some couples, it's not, it's kind of the man's orgasm is seen as the expected finish to a hookup, right? So if you're having sex, if you're hooking up, if you're performing oral sex, if he comes, then that's great. Then that's the end of sex. If she comes, that's a nice bonus. Cool,
Right.
that's great. But doesn't mean sex didn't happen. It's not incomplete. And it's not that all sex has to culminate in orgasm by any means. Plenty of people
Right.
have incredibly fulfilling sex lives or sexual experiences without orgasm. But the disparity, when you look at the numbers and the research, it's
That is
pretty
huge.
telling.
Yeah.
Idea, and if you look at, there's this idea, I think, sorry to
No.
going, but there's this idea that it's just so confusing. It's so hard to make women come. The clitoris or something down there. It's just, what a mystery that vulva is. And I think that too, when you look at these studies, right, when you have two women in a couple, that gap shrinks.
The
So
gap
it's
shrinks.
not that this female body is just so mysterious. It's that people aren't doing the work to figure out what a partner needs and
And
likes.
I think they're often making huge assumptions. I do wonder if the orgasm gap will change, for women in our population who are sleeping with men in their 50s and
Right.
60s. Is it different? I have no interest in sleeping with men in their 20s. That's just not interesting to me. But if I were sleeping with men in their 20s, would it be any better? Has the orgasm gap shrunk for younger people?
I have no idea. My partner is the same age as me.
Yeah.
So, um, but I don't get the sense talking to college students or teenagers that there's a radical shifting. What actually makes me really sad is what seems to be the situation and what seems to resonate when I talk to students about this is that there's still this expectation that the boy will get off, that the
Right.
college guy is gonna, enjoy this. And there's a researcher who actually looks at this among college students recently. I think she's out of NYU, and that's exactly what she has discovered. So among college
Wow.
students, this is
That is really
continuing.
fucked up.
I think also, this whole, to kind of pivot a little bit, there is this idea that has lingered since the 60s sexual revolution that to be a sexually empowered and liberated woman, you have to be down for anything. But
Hmm.
what still continues to happen is that down for anything is often so much just down for,
What?
being available to men. Yeah, being available for what he wants. So there's this whole performative
Yeah.
nature
Yeah.
that still comes out.
I think the performative nature, I hope, is something that does change as you get a little older. I think hopefully women our age are better at saying, this is what I want and this is what I don't want, and I'm not performing. But I think that's the reason sex gets better for women. But it makes me so sad to think of that performative
I
nature.
know that it's.
And there were a couple questions that you asked in a different kind of, not worksheet in your book, but you
Mhm.
have sections where you do questions. And I really liked the idea that everyone should be able to say, like, I can identify 3 things that turn me on. And if I have a partner, they know what these 3
Yeah.
things are. That's a very simple concept that I think doesn't happen enough. Um,
I
you know,
think that comes back to shame, right? People are so embarrassed that they can't talk about what they like, that they think their partners are going to judge them. And let's be honest, partners sometimes do. It's
yeah,
not as if you can get the words out like, I like being spanked. I need to, have this environment. Or I actually only get turned on by X, Y, whatever it is. I'm not
yeah.
being very creative in my thinking right now. But I think people are both afraid of what their partner will say or think of them. And then those partners don't always come through, right?
No, we had this terrible experience once when our group was still on Facebook. A woman wrote in and said that she had been fooling around, having sex with a guy, and she touched herself to make
Mm.
herself come, and he was disgusted and broke up with her. She was like, is this
Oh,
normal? And we were like, oh
oh,
my God.
oh. I mean, that is something, I don't want to say that's such a basic thing, but when people are still walking away from that, or if you break out a vibrator to help yourself get off,
Right.
that somebody feels threatened, that this
Yeah.
threatens their
Yeah.
masculinity, right? That this stuff still happens is
It's
really
very,
disappointing.
very disturbing. Yeah. So again, all the reason for lots and lots of sex ed. Okay, we have one more question now, but it's actually not really related to what we're talking about. So
Oh, no
last
problem.
question, I'm going to respond to it when we get off because it's more about dating, and we'll talk about that
Sure.
another time. But this is so great. I want everyone, I really encourage everyone to check out Ellen's book, Good Sexual Citizenship: How to Create a Sexually Safer World, because it's really not, I mean, there are sections in it about teaching kids and teens, and that's certainly what you do, but the book is bigger than that. It really is about, it's a book about sexuality, about human sexuality and communication, and I thought it was really excellent and well done.
Well, thank
And,
you so much.
and I really appreciate you just talking with us. It's great.
This has been a delight, Nina, and so nice to reconnect and get
Yeah,
to be introduced to your community.
yeah, you too.
All right.
Okay, all right. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.